Well, good morning, Christian. Welcome to this beautiful venue here in Hong Kong, and welcome back to Hong Kong. This is the latest Voices of Experience series. We now call it Vocast, and we're here today at the Crown Wine Cellars in beautiful South Island of Hong Kong. Tell us a little bit about your background. What first brought you to Asia?
Sure, with pleasure. But thanks. First of all, thanks for having me here. Always a pleasure seeing you. Always a pleasure being back in Hong Kong. It's a place where I spent 24 years of my life and extremely formative years, I would say, years of fantastic transformation. So originally, I'm from Italy. I was born in Rome. I studied in between Switzerland and Rome. I'm half Italian, half German, so actually I have also a small part of being Swedish. So I grew up in Rome, but I started my career in close to Venice with the Marzotto Group, that then allowed me to come to Asia after some years in London.
Marzotto Group being in textiles?
No, at the time I was working on the fashion division, and I started my career with a licensed brand from Philip Morris that was called Marlboro Classics, that is not existing anymore.
Did you go into this company because you were really interested in luxury and retail?
The consideration to join luxury and retail was in reality more linked to the fact that I was Italian, but I had the luck that I was growing up with several languages at home. My parents, they spoke French among themselves. I spoke German with my mom. We had some person at home who was speaking English. So I was growing up and my dad was speaking to me in Italian. So I grew up with four languages in a natural way. Plus, I was also studying them in the school, etc. And Swiss school was also multiple languages. I studied in German, but French was very relevant. So I grew up in a multi-language environment. And at the time when I was finishing the university, I was thinking, what is my added value beyond, my education? And I thought that languages could have been, especially at the time, could have been a potential advantage to apply for jobs. So I started thinking, which are the businesses in Italy that are naturally more looking towards an international market?
Yes.
And at the time, there was automotive, furniture, and the fashion. And so I started sending some CVs. I had some connections, family, friends, and I was starting as all young people starting, trying my luck with a few interviews, and I started my career there with Marzotto. That was honestly, I was living in Rome at the time, and Marzotto was in Valdagno. It was a very small village close to Vicenza. And I was going from, and when they called me, I was in New York, spending some holidays with my fiancée at the time, that is today my wife. And and that suddenly, so they called me, and I flew from New York for the interview, and I was really thinking, okay, is this really fashion and luxury? It was a small village in the northern part of Italy, very isolated. And so, but it was an interesting start. Definitely not very luxurious or fashion as an environment, but an extremely rewarding experience because the group was very big at the time. They were owning several brands. They were having a license of Missoni. They owned Hugo Boss in Germany, and a few years later they bought Valentino, and it became Valentino Fashion Group.
Looking back, I guess this was in the 90s then. Was the appeal of Asia something that struck you first, or was it more that the bosses were saying we need to expand in Asia and you go over there and find out what's happening?
It came from a crisis. So I arrived in Asia because of SARS. Uh, I remember at the time I was already living in London. I was taking care of the group in London, and we had a subsidiary in London, and I was stationed there. And at the time, Luca Marzotto, that was based here in Hong Kong, was managing Asia for the group here. And of course, he had other plans also, to grow into the company. And he asked me, would you consider to go to Asia? And at the time, I was 30 years. I was less than 30 years. I was 29. But I think the risk and the challenge for the risk, let's say, for the company was relatively small, because I think it was single digits, the total revenues coming from Asia, of course, excluding Japan, that was something separate at the time.
Right. Yes. Yes.
But it was still a relatively small market, so they could also take a chance with a potentially young manager that of course, full of energy, full of will to drive things and make them happen. But so I arrived in 2004 with the SARS, basically. So it was a very tough start. I
think for the
remember.
benefit of our viewers and listeners here, that SARS was sort of precursor to COVID, which was something I think pretty exclusive to Asia, but it was quite serious at the time. So it was
It
a
was very
public health
serious.
risk as well.
And I remember, there's a fun fact. The first time I started my career here, and the first time I went back to Italy, of course, there was the news of SARS, and I was walking in these long corridors of the Marzotto factory, and I could see people that were normally, saying, "Hi, how you doing?" hugging me in the typical Italian way, and they were like walking around the walls, keeping their distance from me. So it was kind of first come back to Italy after
I remember it well, looking for a volunteer to go to the Swiss watch fair at the time, and in the end it was a Swiss watch fair who said people from Asia should not attend. I remember that. The big advantage looking back, I think, for the sort of kickstart of Asia was the fact that, particularly in Hong Kong, more tourists from the mainland could more freely enter
Correct.
Hong Kong. Prior to SARS, they tended to come in tour groups, and after SARS, they came more individually, and so there was a significant shift in the way that people traveled. And I always look back at that SARS period as really almost like a kick-starting of the rapid growth that we've seen in the past 20 years. Because prior to SARS, we'd gone through our own Asia recession that the rest of the world had not got as
Absolutely.
well. So this was actually, in the end, a disaster that turned very positively long term for the brands.
Yeah, and also the FIT scheme at the time was a game changer also in the quality of the travelers that were coming. So it was not only about the quantity, but it was really much more qualitative customers coming to town. And I think also probably they were also freer to enjoy the experience as a whole. So they were going to restaurants. So we started seeing also, I think, a pickup from, fine dining, five-star hotels. There were a lot of five-star hotels at the time when they were building up. The Ritz-Carlton was still moving on the other side. So I think there was a lot of, it was really a combination of variables that was suddenly giving a great boost to Hong Kong.
In practical terms, though, what did that mean that you had to start to change? Did you have to hire more designers or more training people, HR people to get people in position in the stores?
But first of all, you couldn't take for granted that everybody was speaking Mandarin. A lot of people were speaking Cantonese and not Mandarin. And
Oh, you mean the shop staff?
in the shop staff, yeah.
Absolutely, yes.
So first of all, we needed to ensure that the shop staff was equipped to have an interaction with the customers that suddenly became the majority. And to be honest, these mandatory cultural interaction and the language barrier was something that we started facing not only in Hong Kong, of course, Hong Kong was, but everywhere globally. Even if you travel today, in your global network, you see so many Chinese in the stores, and I think more and more we will see also Indian speaking employees in the stores. And you need to be close to the customers and to have a dialogue and an interaction. You need to have a cultural affinity that is extremely important. So that was definitely the number one action we had to take. And of course also the whole training. We were looking again at training how to interact in a seamless and positive way with the new generation of customers. So it was a lot. And then we started also looking at the product. Of course, there was a high demand of specific products that were meaningful for Chinese culture. So we started looking, I don't know, red products or symbols that were significant, limited editions, the number 8 or the year or that of the I don't know, the dragon or whatever it was. So we started looking at the whole 360-degree experience at store level, from windows to product to staff to training. It was having a significant impact. But not only, also the format of the store started changing, because we realized that we needed larger stores for higher traffic. We needed more seating because people were coming culturally together. Luxury was very often it was an individual experience, and suddenly we had groups of people coming, with the families. Different generation was also, they were coming together. So we needed to take care of different generation that were coming in the same time in the stores. So it was a whole change for the industry, I think. We are still in the learning process, by the way, because luxury and retail is around a product that is linked to culture. So the narrative has to be also significant relative to your product, but it needs to be also clear and meaningful for certain specific cultures. So it's a blend of culture at the end of the day. So you bring your own culture while you try to understand, how can I be more meaningful for some customers.
How does it work though? In mainland China, in most of the cities, there's very little tourism from outside the country. In places like Singapore, Hong Kong, Bangkok, you've got tourists coming from everywhere. Are there different challenges, different setups that you need to think about, compare with, let's say, opening a store in Chengdu versus Bangkok or Singapore or even Hong Kong?
Listen, retail is extremely granular. Some stores, they cater to specific customers. So we are even in the same city, you need to do some adaptation sometimes.
Yes.
Sometimes you have private rooms because you have a clientele that doesn't want to, to be seen or too much exposed, or they want to have the personal journey with the brand. Sometimes you have formats where you need to accommodate larger groups, a larger amount of people. So it's really, city by city, I would say. And in the same city, you might have even having different formats that are targeting, different needs. I mean, from department stores to flagship stores, it's a completely different range of experience, but they're both meaningful for a specific community, a specific customer that is looking for efficiency or service or speed. And of course, there is, in all this mix, there is the hybridization that has been coming from the explosion of the digital world. So it's, e-commerce, social platforms, marketplaces. I mean, these years have been incredibly disruptive. And I think we are still working today on a hybridization of the model where,
Yes.
never out of stock shelves in the store. So a lot of activity, sales activity today is even done at store level, but through an iPad maybe, because the reality is that you cannot keep the whole inventory that we would like to have in a store. So very often, you work with hybrid models where you generate the experience, the connection with the brand at store level. You have the opportunity to have probably a better narrative, a better storytelling. You have more time with the customer to interact and to tell your story as a brand. But in the meantime, the digitalization and the whole supply chain and logistics that is behind is helping you to have potentially an infinite shelf.
Well, that's what actually started it off, because probably in the 1950s, for example, a lot of luxury was face-to-face in Milan, in Rome, in Paris, often meeting the designer as well. It was sort of almost made to order. The big change, I think, started to come in the 1970s with air freight, and then international travel came as well.
Absolutely.
And people from other countries started to see things and be exposed to things they hadn't seen at home. And then it was brought out to those markets as well. But what advice would you give today? I mean, you were a pioneer. Today, in such a big business, not everybody is coming from Paris and Rome and Milan to run the businesses. You're hiring senior people locally as well. What advice would you give them? Because they come out here, they've got all the language skills, they've got all the cultural skills, but what do they need to know about head office in order to connect with people who might never work in outside their own home country? So it's almost as if things have got onto the other foot over the last 20, 30 years.
I think we need to address a few different things. First of all, you mentioned about the change of air travel in our industry. I completely concur. The speed of having products globally, potentially same day that you launch them, has been an incredible game changer. So definitely, but also air travel has been giving, and I would say a democratic possibility to travel. When air travel started in the 40s, in the 50s, there were a very few amount of people that could travel abroad. Today, everyone is traveling everywhere and is willing to experience the real deal in Paris, in Milan, in Rome, in Florence, in London, and vice versa. People from Europe and United States, they want to see the real deal in Tokyo, in Beijing. So I think travel has been definitely shrinking the world, but has been also bringing a lot of opportunities for our industry in terms of speed and execution. I mean, just think, the amount of see now, wear now, buy now, whatever how you want to call it, how impactful it has been also for the luxury industry and the fundamental acceleration that it brought. But I also believe that this extreme speed has been bringing also the necessity to reconsider a news law. And I think people are really willing to spend more time and interact with the authentic thing. So on your question about how can we bring the narrative to in the stores, of course, the deployment comes with, if you have a story to tell, and it needs to be authentic, but it becomes even more authentic, and this is what we are trying to do, and we are doing, but several luxury brands are doing it. We are bringing our customers, especially top customers, to experience the true nature of the brand where it was born, or where it can be seen at its best. A fashion show, a museum, or an experience in the birthplace of the brand,
Right.
where you have all the assets and the opportunities to show your history in the most authentic way. And you can use even factories, you can use logistics, warehouses, or even to show this blend of manufacturing, technology, heritage that makes the luxury world so interesting. It's always this blend of heritage, craftsmanship, blended with technology, artificial intelligence, extremely fast logistics,
which is constantly moving as well.
Which is constantly moving. Yeah. So this fine balance between, one of our shareholders in the past for a company I was working was always saying an analogy that I really like, that is about having roots and wings. So the roots are part of your culture, of your heritage, and the wings are all the things that makes you fast, dream about what's next. And so to find this balance between roots and wings was, I think it's a tremendous analogy. Really come back to your question. So what we are trying to do as well in the industry and definitely for the company I've been working for is to bring the customers to experience the world of the company, of the brand, but also the employees to experience that. So top employees, and it's also a form of cultural integration, but is also very often is also a way to reward the most motivated
Right.
staff
Yes.
to live the experience in full. So from the luxury hotel where you might host them to going to the headquarters, living the beauty of the headquarters, living the manufacturing process. That is extremely interesting. We have over the years I've been having different experience with different companies. But when you see the behind the scene, and it's a real authentic behind the scene, it's not just a storytelling, but you see people crafting, you see it's incredible, and customers and employees they all get very attached to the brand because this experience they can live in reality. And what is even happening now more and more, I think there is a further hybridization, I would say, of the experience where the core products are probably not enough. The products become almost a souvenir of the experience. So it's very interesting. So you put together, and being Italian, and I'm working now in Florence. You have so many assets that are beyond your company, but they are part of the experience. So just Florence, imagine the asset that I have. It's an incredible city, and but again, when you have this kind of assets and you blend them with hotels, with restaurants, with
Right. Yes.
wineries, etc., this makes an incredible experience that very often money can buy because it's an experience that brands are putting together and are giving access to employees or top customers for a very clear reason that is not for everyone, but is for the people we really, really treasure.
Would you say the experiential factor is something to focus on here? Because I think just before COVID, we were still experiencing almost growth that was out of control and not necessarily qualitative in certain respects. We were all having to run too fast. After COVID, everybody had to think, and during COVID had to think as well. So is experiential factors something now which you have to take into account when you're managing the business and not simply transactional product?
I think it's fundamental. First of all, transactional relations, I think are not relevant. They're not sticky to customers. It's a one shot, but it doesn't build up all the time.
Right.
And what is extremely relevant for luxury brands is the lifetime value and lifetime value that you build with your customers. And you can only build lifetime value if you have a frequent interaction over time and you really connected in some way. So the experience it's part of this frequency and it's part of your real interaction in depth. I've been working for mostly family companies where the family also gets directly involved in interacting with the customers, having the feedback, having the relation. And for the customers, it's part of the experience as well to meet the families or the founders of the business that can give them the full perspective on what the brand stands for and also the vision of the brand seen from family eyes that are, of course, always thinking of the next generation naturally. So I believe that experience is fundamental today. And of course, every brand can generate a different experience depending on the assets that they have. But it can be, a museum, it can be a factory, a manufacturing process, it can be a logistic warehouse that is extremely advanced. It can be a hotel belonging to maybe to the group, or a restaurant belonging to the group, or a cafe belonging to the group. Or it can be, the visit of the archives that is not open for everyone, or the visit of the factory. So I mean, again, every brand, every experience, every company has its own assets, but I think they become a very important part of the touch points and of the journey that customers are having with your brand.
Are there partnerships that need to be made in this part of the world as well, with property developers or private clubs or whatever, because the whole atmosphere out here is very different from Italy or France.
Absolutely.
Quite naturally, it has a different evolution. Yet what we're doing is selling the culture and the experience of old Europe here in New Asia. So, are there tips that you would give to managers now to find ways to collaborate with the movers and shakers in this part of the world?
I believe that collaboration is always very important. And collaboration can take different shapes and forms. Uh, you mentioned landlords or business partners, they are fundamental. We are a very seamless partnership, I would say. We have a very seamless partnership because, they wouldn't exist without the brands, and we would have a very difficult life without them.
Mm.
So it would be much more difficult to interact with customers and be able to expose your product and your brands. Uh, but I think what is happening today more and more is that we are interacting more and more with, again, landlords, or department stores, etc., to target and their, as example, the top customers, and give them a unique experience in our stores or beyond our stores around the
Right.
world.
Yes.
So that's fundamental thing. But we are also working, and a lot of brands are working also on local collaborations with relevant clubs or relevant artists to again get closer to the local communities and to enhance, I would say, the sense of belonging to a certain community or to a certain brand. And sometimes there is even collaborations of non-competing brands, but are offering maybe a similar experience or a similar journey to customers. I don't know, it could be fashion with wine, or fashion with whiskey, or cigars and whiskey, or there is different models. But again, even brands that are working in the same space and are talking to the automotive, and are talking to the same clientele, it's very easy to do collaboration where in some way you bring your lifestyle also locally. And it's something that I think is becoming meaningful. Another very, very obvious thing is like on the food and beverage, again, Italy has an incredible culture of food, and you can bring the Tuscan food, or you can bring all the French food for the French brands. And I think this is part of the whole experience, because experience is culture at the end of the day. It's culture of the brand, it's culture of the nation where the brand started. And so to use the I think culture is really the relevant word here, to how to bring your own culture beyond your territory.
In your resume, it's quite clear that you have some independent directorship, some advisory roles there. What was the motivation behind that, and what tips could you give to our viewers about the benefits that brings, not only to your own career, but also, I think, the other way around, from the companies that you help advise?
So what was driving me was, you know, you when you reach a certain age, you start feeling, a few needs that become more and more important. On one side, you you really want to contribute to society and the community more. So I started working with non-profit organizations, joining some of the boards, and or or the Italian Chamber of Commerce, or some non-profit organizations, and you start realizing that you can be an advisor on things because you have some mileage, and you can be helpful also for the networking of the organization. You can be helpful to find resources for the organization, and
Right.
and this is part of your contribution to the community. You can be a contributor yourself by all means, and I think so. I started seeing this need of giving back on one side. That was one aspect. The other aspect, I also wanted to grow professionally, and I wanted to move from being again, maybe comes with age, from being let's say a player to a coach. You realize that sometimes you can contribute on a play field even as a coach, and actually you can be a great contributor. And plus, being a coach gives you, and this is how I see boards, you become a bit more distant from the game, because you are non-executive, and you can take a bit of distance, but it helps you also to see the things maybe a bit more from a distance, but a bit more broadly and a bit more strategically. So I felt I had this need to progress my career with first starting contributing, and then also contributing to companies with my knowledge on specific tasks. Of course, to join boards, you need to ask yourself, what's your contribution, what's your value proposition to join a specific board. And there might be boards that they are not the right fit. You are not the right fit because they don't need your expertise, or simply you are the wrong fit because your mission is not in line or in tune with your capacity. So I think to join boards that are very naturally close to your strength and to your values is very important. So I joined a few boards beyond the non-profit, etc. boards. I joined a few boards that, first of all, are family companies that I know. I think I've been always working. I always say I've been not working for brands. I've been working for families. And this is very much in my
DNA.
DNA. Exactly. Thank you. I simply like to work for families because they have a very long vision. They always think, next generation. And I like this, especially in luxury. You need time to build up things. You cannot always be super fast.
Absolutely. Yes,
You need respect of your brand. You need respect of the communities. You need respect of the product, and you build this respect and credibility over time. And families have this approach to longevity and to next generation. So the boards I joined so far have been family companies, or founder of second, third, fourth generation,
right.
where I feel my knowledge of the dynamics of, and sometimes families can be very complex. There is 3, 4 generations at the same time, different members, different perspectives, but that makes it particularly enriching for as a board member. The other aspect is my value proposition was probably very linked around the knowledge, because I've been on the ground for many years of markets, in particular about Asian markets, where there is still a lot of changes and constant changes, and the fact that I constantly travel and I'm always on the ground helps me to talk to people, talk to partners, to employees, and I'm always having a relatively fresh perspective on what's happening in the markets. And the third value proposition I was bringing to the table was, of course, my retail journey, from processes to to the how to build the touch points with customers, the storytelling. So this is a thing. So you need to understand what is that you bring to the table to join the right boards, I think.
What do you do for time off? You travel so much. You need to have a work-life balance. So
Yeah, I do travel quite a lot. I think I travel probably 400,000 miles a year. average, and I've been doing this for the past 30 years. Uh, so the little time I have left, I try to spend with my family, of course, when I can. And I love playing golf and I love skiing. And I try to blend family and sports together. So my wife started playing golf with me. So when we see each other, we start playing a bit of golf together. And I have every year I do 1 week skiing with my daughter. My wife doesn't ski, so that's my time with her.
Great.
I always try also to understand the cities and what's happening in the cities with a small hat of pleasure. So I love art. I love contemporary art. So I try to visit some art galleries and
You do
so
painting yourself as well?
no, I don't. I
No.
don't. I used to paint when I was very, very young, I guess, like we all did. But no, I don't paint. And I love music. I always travel with very, good equipment. So even when I travel, I have very good equipment that helps me to enjoy the music even when I travel. And then I love my food. I love my wine. And this is part when I travel. I try also to try good restaurants and because it's also part of my personal journey. But I think it's very important to be knowledgeable also for your customers to understand where they go, what they're likely doing. So it's you need to leave the full experience also that your customers are having, and it's very important that you are up to date on what's hot in every city.
Any advice or tips and ideas about virtual meetings? In my case, I always say if I know the people well, then I'll always consider the option of not traveling and do it virtually, and then really focus my travel on new learning experience or things I can only do by actually being on the spot. How did COVID teach you?
Listen, on one side, it opened for infinite opportunities. We started during COVID, we started doing town halls, I know, retail town halls, where you got the whole population of the company at once. You needed to manage a bit the time zones, and it was not always the best for certain part of the demographics of the company because they were living on one side or the other of the world. So we had to adapt a bit, but ultimately it opened infinite opportunity to talk to all your, community, retail community to say. And this has been incredibly powerful because you could deliver messages clearly, fast, efficiently, without the need of traveling. In the meantime, I think we all realize how important is the human interaction in our industry. Human interaction with employees, human interaction with customers. This is really what makes a difference. And I believe that certain meetings cannot be done virtually. And I'm still puzzled sometimes. I receive a virtual meeting requests from a guy that is in the office close to me sending me, shall we meet on team? I say, no, listen, I'm old school. Let me offer you a coffee. Let's meet in front of the coffee machine. Let's start the conversation
Well,
there.
the same with this meeting. We could have had this meeting months ago virtually, but we've waited till the chance to
It's different. It's
sit in front of
different.
each other.
It's and you miss so much of the non-verbal communication if you are not in person. And non-verbal communication, it's probably in human interaction is plays the biggest part. More than words is the non-verbal that matters. And you cannot understand the non-verbal in virtual meetings, unfortunately.
And I think right across Asia, and I mean that absolutely all the way from Japan right down to Australia, the speed of change. You might be away from a particular city in Asia, and 3 months later, it's full of hoardings in the main street, which you probably would not see in Florence or Paris or Milan in the same way. And you wouldn't be aware of this environmental change. Now, it's all progress. So at the same time, you need to be aware of that, I think, on the ground because it affects the customer psyche as well, that fast pace of change isn't necessarily ideal for the luxury brands unless they're there to help manage that change in their own interests.
Absolutely. But again, let me give you another example that I think where, you know, you, you see a lot of pictures in our industry from, I don't know, a newly built store or the visual merchandising display in a store. And from the picture, it looks perfect. And you say, oh, it looks good. Then you go in person and you start seeing things that you're not happy about. I was just recently traveling with our chairman, and there were so many obvious things that we could have done better in a specific store. If you're not there on the ground, you don't see them. So I think, it's very important to still, to capture the finest details and to understand, the whole thing. You need to be in person. Similarly, as you mentioned, for locations, we've been, looking for locations over the years, both of us, and you work on paper on a project, then you go on site and you figure out there is a column that you were not expecting, there is a wall that is different than the one you were thinking, there is a corridor or a door you don't like, and if you don't see that in person, it's impossible. So
I agree. And I think when you look globally as well, there are three distinct types of real estate, for want of a better word. The department stores dominated still in Japan and Korea, Taiwan
absolutely,
perhaps, declining in some other markets. In other markets, they never existed. Then you've got probably in the older world, in Western Europe and perhaps certain cities in the US, Canada, real estate, where you actually, business development is looking at investing in real estate that's going to plant the brand there for a good many decades. Whereas for the most part, the most productive markets in Asia now, it's all about working with landlords, and it's about renting space and knowing who your neighbors are. So you're not necessarily one or two brands in a particular street, but 40 or 50 in the same shopping center.
clustering.
So I think that's absolutely vital, that top management be on the ground and that their teams understand these nuances, because things shift. What might have been a great location 10 years ago might have shifted through literally the sands of time, the change.
Absolutely. And I think, if you don't mind me adding one more point to that, especially for very dynamic markets like China, I always think in my head the analogy of bamboo. While very often some locations in the Western world, they've been created over the years. It's like a tree that grows and the inner circle and then it's expands, but the inner circle remains always the same. So some streets, some high streets in the world, they've been there high streets for centuries sometimes.
Yes.
Think in Florence, there is the high street there. It's been the high street there for 300 years probably. And same thing for other cities in Europe. In China, a mall that was extremely successful 5 years ago today might be challenged by a new winner, and is offering bigger size, because better services, better environment, and they constantly grow. Also in location that would not be expected. China has been developing, suddenly new CBDs district that become extremely relevant because maybe, the whole, they are able to move a massive community, from finance to press to local authorities, and suddenly becomes a place where there was nothing, becomes extremely relevant. So you need to be always up to the speed. But, sometimes, and this is where I think to have also management that is really connected also to the community, even of competitors community, we all compete in the same space, but we cannot live without each other. As you said, we need each other to create a credible environment where, and we need landlords to be also credible in that space. So we really work, even if in competition, but I think it's important.
Landlords, clientele, of course, competitors in the non-competitive space, shall we shall we call it, but also architects, um, even right down to the fit out contractors. I mean, architects are not actually building the stores. This is not something that's going to be done from head office, and they need to understand as well. So I think the challenges in Asia are just very different
Completely.
from the old one. And it's not to say that the markets in Asia have no history; they just have a different history. And there are streets in Japan, in the older cities in China, Korea, that are centuries old as well, but they're not suited to what we do. Um, and I think that's also been part of the challenge over the years, that these, as we call them, landlords, were very strong in office development, hotel development, perhaps even residential, but retail is very new. It only goes back probably 25 years for the, not even that. So, and they change as well. These are larger organizations where, in my view, at least, we have to stay in constant contact, because every 3 to 5 years, the key contacts are moving up or across into other unrelated divisions.
No, absolutely. And I understand, it's difficult also, I assume for them to understand, first of all, to do a balanced, space allocation where, the offer diversity remains wide enough to be pleasant to navigate as a customer. So we should never forget the relevance of customers, to ensure that
Mm.
they can get a full experience on different brands, on a portfolio that is exciting. Otherwise, sometimes I wonder today, that most they are basically super dominated by one or two players. Great, but how relevant is it for a customer? That's something I start wondering. Second, I think it's very important that also most they evolve, with the times. I can see today, as example, in Chinese malls, what is interesting, you see more and more, aside of Chinese brands coming up, they are extremely successful in the
Indeed.
athleisure space or in the automotive. But two phenomena that I found extremely interesting is the relevance of local brands, especially in F&B. So restaurants that were famous, but they were having somewhere a place that was not in a mall, had been now brought into malls, so that they remain locally very relevant, but in a better environment. The other thing that I found extremely interesting is how some landlords are looking at also adding to the mix, Korean or Japanese brands that are today, very interesting in terms of innovation. So, it is a constant evolution of, things, I think.
Speeded up by social media, and even the COVID period when everything was extremely quiet on the face-to-face front. Probably online business started to grow, online to offline connections became more important. And as you say, it gave the opportunity for emerging brands to find new ways
Absolutely.
to move into space which was occupied perhaps largely by European brands.
Absolutely. And some of these brands, they start also competing for resources, because they are looking at European brands that have been for some time in the ground, and of course have very well managed training programs. So they look for very skilled people that are, great salespeople, but great also storytellers, super groomed, and know how to interact with customers. So it's a competing world on that space, definitely. And talent is the most important resource that a company has. Good people, motivated people, is what can be really a game changer.
We've talked quite a lot about China, and in this context, the Chinese mainland. We talked a little bit about Japan, which is probably the mother market out here in Asia. Uh, Korea has also come along in a similar time scale to Chinese mainland. What about emerging markets? Are there any opportunities left in, if not in this part of the world, perhaps in other parts of the world? I really know particular expertise about Brazil, but Vietnam comes to mind, Brazil comes to mind,
Middle East.
Middle East.
I mean, Middle East is on fire. I mean, of course, and this was an effect of COVID. A lot of the wealthy community started moving to Dubai, as example, during COVID, because it was much more free. You were not having this very strong restrictions we were having at the
Right.
time
Yes, I
here in
recall
Hong
that. Yes,
Kong
yes,
or in
yes.
Japan. So Dubai started its real acceleration thanks to COVID, I believe, because a lot of people they started moving there, saying, I'm out of here. It's unbearable, and so they started attracting a lot of global wealth. Then, of course, also Russia happened, and a lot of people moved out from Russia and are living now in Dubai. So they were able to attract a massive Indian community. So there are global cities that are on the rise. So I think Middle East in general is probably the most interesting accelerated things, but Vietnam is extremely interesting. Indonesia is extremely interesting, I believe. There is 230 million citizens, I think, and half of the population is below 30 years old. I'm
I,
going by heart here.
I always think about the Philippines and Indonesia. One of the biggest challenges, they are archipelagos. Um, and the movement around these countries is very different from perhaps the way we've developed China, which is a large continental mass. And any thoughts to that?
Listen, I see, I'm thinking more than sometimes more than the country per se. I found interest in, how can a brand interact with the culture, with the community beyond the country. I mean, let me give you the example of Indonesia. You said, rightly said, Indonesians are an extremely important customers worldwide today, and similar for Indian, extremely important. But if you see at the market size and the potential in terms of infrastructure that today India has, is still very limited. You can develop maybe 4 cities, 5 cities today as a luxury brand. There is not much more. There is not enough
And
malls.
probably complications with tariffs and
Of
state
course, needless
taxes
to say, needless to say.
as well. I remember having this conversation 25 years ago, India versus China, and they simply have different structures and outlooks. But I also agree with you that when you look at the Indian consumer or the Indonesian consumer is where else does she or he shop? So the
Correct.
Middle East, or in the case in the early days with the Japanese in Korea duty free, or Hong Kong and Singapore. So market development, for example, the Indonesian market might not take, or India might not necessarily take place entirely in India or Indonesia. It might be taking place now in Dubai or Abu Dhabi, as an example, London, Paris, Hong Kong, Singapore. And
Absolutely.
again, I think all that comes back to the people we hire and the way we train people as well. And I think the days have gone where we can just count on easy sales to people from North Asia have gone, and now it's become even multicultural within the boutique, not just language, but everything else that goes with it.
Absolutely. I mean, we live in a multicultural world. We need to keep adapting. I also wonder, there is some emerging African countries that in terms of local
Oh,
domestic market, it's still very premature. But the Nigeria, let me give you an example of Nigeria. I mean, they are really, high spenders in the luxury industry, and then they're very well traveled from London to Dubai to New York, and we need to keep an open eye and see if the market develops to a point that becomes interesting to start building a network.
well, it's been fascinating talking with you today, Christian.
It's been my pleasure.
The weather is getting warmer and sunnier since we've been talking. So we'll wrap it up then. So thank you so much, and look forward to the next time.
Amazing. Always good seeing you, my friend.
Thank you.